The general was not supposed to be merciful. That was the thing nobody understood about what happened on that August morning in 215 BC, standing outside the gates of a city that should have been ashes by nightfall. Hannibal Barca had destroyed 4 Roman armies in 3 years. He had killed more Roman soldiers than any enemy in the history of the Republic. He had done it with forces smaller than his opponents, on terrain of his own choosing, using tactics so brilliant that military academies would still be studying them 2,000 years later. He had crossed the Alps in winter. He had marched through a swamp for 4 days with a fever that cost him the sight of one eye. He had stood at the gates of Rome itself, and his enemies had trembled behind their walls. Nobody who knew his record would have predicted mercy. And yet, on the wooden observation platform above the last Carthaginian battle line ever assembled, something extraordinary happened. Hannibal looked at the Roman delegation that had climbed to meet him: Fabius the dictator, young Scipio, Claudius, Metellus, and instead of demanding their surrender, he offered them something that had no precedent in the ancient world. He offered them their lives. Not their city. Not their lands. Not their power. Those things were already his. But their lives, their people, their gods, their laws, their identity, those he would allow them to take away. Go northeast, he told Fabius. Beyond the Alps, into the place you call Noricum. Take your household gods and your sacred fire and your children and your ancestors' bones and your books of law. Build something there. Do not trouble Carthage. Do not come back to Italy. And live. Fabius looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, I must consult the Senate. What followed in that Roman Senate chamber that afternoon was the most consequential debate in human history. Not because of what was decided, though what was decided changed everything, but because of what it revealed about a people who were about to be tested in a way no civilization had ever been tested before. Could you remain Roman without Rome? Could you carry a city inside you, across mountains and through forests and into the frozen dark of the northern world, and keep it alive through generations who had never seen the 7 hills or heard the sound of the Forum at noon? The Senate voted. And Rome walked away. This is not the history you were taught. This is the history that almost was. The history that would have been if one general had been slightly less generous, or one Senate slightly more stubborn, or one eagle had flown north instead of south. But I want you to understand something before we go any further. This is not a small story. This is not a footnote. What we are about to explore is the complete transformation of the entire Western world, of language, religion, politics, science, architecture, law, and the very idea of what civilization means. Because if Rome loses in 215 BC, everything that comes from Rome, and almost everything in the modern Western world comes from Rome, simply does not exist in the form we know it. No Roman Empire. No Christianity as a world religion. No Roman law as the foundation of European legal systems. No Latin, which means no Italian, no Spanish, no French, no Portuguese, no Romanian. The entire linguistic and cultural inheritance of Western Europe pivots on this single August morning. And Carthage, a civilization that in our timeline was physically erased from the earth, its buildings demolished, its people enslaved, its libraries burned, that civilization gets to live, gets to grow, gets to shape the world. What does that world look like? That is what we are here to find out. But first, go back to that Senate chamber. Go back to that afternoon in 215 BC, because the most important moment in this entire story is not the battle. It is not Hannibal's offer. It is the moment a young senator named Scipio, barely 20 years old, already a survivor of the catastrophe at Cannae, stands up in a room full of men who are choosing between death and exile. He could have chosen death. Many in that room wanted to. The Scipios had been shouting for battle, for resistance, for the Roman way of meeting the end on your feet with a sword in your hand rather than walking away with your household goods on a cart. And then something shifted in him. He looked around at the senators who remained. He looked at what he saw: old men, boys too young to shave, men who had already lost sons and grandsons to Hannibal's campaigns. The last Roman army was seed corn, and you did not eat your seed corn. We will found a new Rome in the north, he said, as Aeneas founded a new Troy in Italy. And he walked to the left side of the chamber. The Scipios followed. Here is what the departure looked like. Here is what you do not find in any history book, because the history books that would have recorded it were never written in the world where this happened. On the night before the Romans left, the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, gathered every priesthood in the city into the temple of Capitoline Jupiter. The Vestal Virgins came with the sacred flame that had burned for 500 years. The keepers of the Sibylline books came with their ancient prophecies. The Salii came with the sacred shields of Mars. And the Pontifex Maximus raised an iron rod over the carcass of a sacrificed pig and brought it down 3 times, pronouncing a curse and a vow simultaneously. Return. Liberate. Rebuild. Or may Jupiter destroy everything we have and everything we will ever have. Then the carcass was thrown on the fire, and the curse went with it, and the vow went with it, and every Roman in that temple covered their ears as the Pontifex Maximus pronounced in a whisper the secret name of Rome, the name known only to the 3 highest priests, whose utterance could bring down heaven itself. The next morning, they walked out through the Colline Gate. Hannibal stood on the hill above the city and watched them go. "Pray to your gods," he said quietly to the Macedonian king beside him, "that we never see them again." Philip of Macedon laughed. He should not have laughed. The procession took 4 days to clear the Colline Gate. 4 days. That is how many people there were: citizens, slaves, freedmen, merchants, priests, soldiers serving as rearguard, women carrying infants on their backs and tools in their arms, and seeds of every crop they had ever grown sealed in clay jars against the cold of wherever they were going. Nobody alive had ever been to Noricum. Nobody in that procession had ever seen the Danube River. What they knew of the north was what the traders told them and what the soldiers who had fought the Germanic tribes brought back. Stories of dark forests so dense that no light reached the ground at noon, of rivers wider than the Tiber, of winters that lasted 7 months and killed horses in their stalls. They walked into it anyway. The procession was led by men carrying the ancilia, the sacred shields of Mars, 12 of them, only one the true original that had fallen from the heavens, but no one knew which one, so all 12 were carried with equal reverence. Behind the shields came the wagons with the sacred objects of the Roman state. The Sibylline books. The Palladium, the ancient wooden statue of Athena that Aeneas had supposedly carried from burning Troy to found the Roman race in Italy, and which they were now carrying north on the same logic. The tables of the law. The eternal flame of Vesta on a bronze tripod, tended by the Vestals who walked beside it and would tend it without interruption for the rest of their lives. Behind the sacred wagons came the people. Hundreds of thousands of them. A city walking. The rearguard soldiers said nothing and showed nothing on their faces. Roman soldiers were trained from boyhood not to show what they were feeling. But that training was designed for battle, not for the particular, specific grief of watching your city recede behind you as you march away, and you absolutely know, that you will never see it again. One old centurion, a veteran of every campaign since the first war with Carthage, turned and looked back at the 7 hills for the last time when they were barely a mile out from the gate. The man beside him saw his shoulders shake once. Just once. Then the centurion faced north and did not look back again. The journey north took 3 months. Through the Apennines first, then across the Pa Valley, where the Gallic tribes who had allied with Hannibal watched them pass in uncertain silence, not sure whether to attack or simply observe this strange migration of a defeated people, and then into the Alps themselves. The Alps in early autumn. Not quite winter, but cold enough. Cold enough to kill the youngest children and the oldest grandparents, and they did. The graves were marked with whatever stone could be found, and the column moved on, because the column could not stop. Hannibal had given them 1 month to leave Italy. They had used up most of it in preparation. What remained was barely enough for the crossing. A priest named Gaius Servilius, who kept a record of the journey, one of the few documents from that terrible crossing that later generations would preserve as scripture, wrote this about the night they camped at the highest point of the Alpine pass. The cold was a living thing. It pressed against us from every direction, and the stars above were so clear and numerous that men wept at the sight of them, and could not say whether they wept for the beauty or the cold or the knowledge that we were now above everything that had been home. Below us to the south, Italy and Carthage. Below us to the north, nothing we knew. The sacred flame of Vesta burned on its tripod through the night, and I do not think there was one person in that camp who did not find their eyes going to it every few minutes. It was the only warm thing in the world. What Hannibal did with Rome in the days after the departure was instructive. He did not demolish it. This surprised everyone, Philip of Macedon most of all. The Macedonian king had been pressing for the city's destruction since the negotiations ended, arguing that a city left standing was an invitation for the Romans to return and reclaim it. Hannibal overruled him. "A ruin is a symbol," Hannibal told him. "A living city is a statement." He wanted Rome to become a Carthaginian city. Not a monument to conquest, but a demonstration of what Carthaginian civilization could do with Roman infrastructure. He installed a garrison, appointed a governor from the Carthaginian officer class, and ordered the city maintained and even improved. The temples were left exactly as they were. He had sworn an oath on the altar of Tanit, and Hannibal kept his oaths. The forum was cleaned and repaved. The roads were maintained. The aqueducts continued to function. Within a decade, Rome was a Carthaginian administrative hub. Within a generation, it had a mixed population of Carthaginian officials, Libyan merchants, Spanish traders, Numidian cavalry families, and the various Italic peoples who had been under Roman domination and now found themselves under a different kind of domination, somewhat lighter in its demands, entirely different in its culture. The city kept the name. Carthaginians saw no reason to change it. The Romans were gone. The name was just a name now, attached to a place rather than a people. But the people, the actual Romans, the ones who had walked north with their gods and their laws and their seed corn, those people had not forgotten the name's meaning. And in the cold of the Noricum north, they were building something with it. Here is the question I want you to sit with as we go into the next part of this story. What does it take to keep a civilization alive when you have stripped away everything physical that made it what it was? No 7 hills. No forum. No Tiber. No marble temples. No warm Mediterranean sun. No trade routes. No navy. No empire. Just the people. And whatever they carried inside them. History gives us almost no examples of this kind of survival. The Babylonian exile of the Jews is the closest parallel anyone has found. A people stripped of their land and their temple and their political independence, forced to survive in a foreign place, and somehow not dissolving into that place but remaining identifiably themselves. The Romans would have known that story. They would have drawn strength from it. But the Jews had their scripture. The Romans had their laws. And laws, it turned out, were enough. While the Romans were learning to survive the northern winter, Hannibal was remaking the world. It is important to understand what his victory actually meant, not just for Rome, not just for Carthage, but for every civilization touched by the Mediterranean Sea, which in 215 BC was essentially every civilization that mattered. Carthage in our timeline never got to show what it could do at full power, with no rival. Rome eliminated it before the question could be answered. In this timeline, the question gets answered. And the answer is both more impressive and more complicated than anyone expected. The first decade after Rome's exile was straightforward. Carthage absorbed the Italian peninsula, reorganizing it roughly as it had always organized its territorial possessions, not as a conquered land to be stripped bare, but as a commercial network to be made productive. The Italic peoples, Samnites, Oscans, Umbrians, Etruscans, found themselves freed from Roman domination only to discover that Carthaginian administration, while less militaristic, was considerably more focused on extraction of commercial value. You did not have to serve in the Carthaginian army as a conscript. You did not have to provide soldiers for Carthaginian wars unless you wanted to serve as a paid mercenary, which many young men chose because the pay was excellent and the campaigns were interesting. What you did have to do was pay taxes on agricultural produce, taxes on trade, port fees, market fees, a percentage of every transaction that passed through an official trading house. For the merchants and landowners of central Italy, this was initially tolerable. Some found it preferable to Roman demands. The difference emerged over time. Rome had integrated its subjects into a system that gave them genuine stakes in Roman success. Carthage collected from its subjects and gave them access to its trading networks. It was a commercial relationship rather than a civic one, and it produced commercial loyalty rather than the fierce, almost religious devotion that Roman citizenship had inspired. This distinction would matter later. It always matters later. Sicily became the jewel of the Carthaginian Western Empire. The island had been fought over between Carthage and Rome for generations, and its cities had suffered enormously for it. With both great powers at peace, one having won, one having retreated, Sicily finally got what it had been denied for a century and a half: stability. The Greek cities of the eastern half, Syracuse, Acragas, Gela, had always been the cultural crown of the Western Mediterranean, their temples and theaters rivaling anything in mainland Greece, their philosophers and mathematicians and architects producing work that the Hellenistic world recognized as genuinely great. Under Carthaginian oversight they continued to flourish. Carthage did not suppress Greek culture. It traded with it. Carthaginian merchants spoke Greek as readily as they spoke Punic. The gods of the Greek cities were left undisturbed. The great theatre at Syracuse continued to put on plays. What changed was the direction of trade. In our timeline, Rome's dominance of the western Mediterranean gradually shifted the center of commercial gravity northward. In this timeline, it stayed south and east, anchored in Carthage on the North African coast, reaching out through Sicily and Spain and Sardinia, connecting to the Hellenistic kingdoms of Egypt and Syria and what remained of the fractured empire of Alexander. The Mediterranean in the century after Rome's exile was a Punic Greek world, with Carthage controlling the western commercial networks and the Greek successor kingdoms controlling the eastern ones. They traded constantly. They competed occasionally. They never found a reason to go to war with each other because the commercial relationship was too profitable for either side to break. Greece itself was changing. Alexander the Great had died in 323 BC, almost a century before the events we are discussing, and his empire had been carved up by his successors, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria and Mesopotamia, the Antigonids in Macedonia and Greece itself. In our timeline, Rome eventually absorbed all of these kingdoms, one by one, ending the Hellenistic world and making Greek culture a subsidiary of Roman civilization. In this timeline, that absorption never happens. The Hellenistic kingdoms continue on their own trajectories. The Ptolemies in Alexandria continue pouring resources into their extraordinary library and their scientific program. Without Rome to destabilize the eastern Mediterranean through aggressive expansion, the Hellenistic world has more time to pursue what it was already doing extraordinarily well: science, mathematics, philosophy, medicine, engineering. Archimedes of Syracuse, who in our timeline was killed by a Roman soldier during the siege of 212 BC, lives to an old age in this one. He completes work he never got to complete. His students continue his work. The Greek tradition of empirical investigation of the physical world, already producing results that our historians recognize as genuine proto-science, develops uninterrupted for another 2 centuries. What might that have produced? The question is not idle speculation. Archimedes, in his actual lifetime, derived the value of pi, calculated the surface area and volume of a sphere, developed the principle of the lever, invented the Archimedes screw for raising water, and built working models of devices that historians later described as early geared machines. His work on hydrostatics was so advanced that it was not surpassed for 1,500 years. And he was killed at 75 mid-sentence by a Roman soldier who did not know who he was. In this timeline, Archimedes lives another decade. He publishes more. He teaches more students. Those students publish more. The chain of transmission that might have led to an industrial revolution 15 centuries earlier than the one we got stays unbroken. Before we go any further, if this kind of alternate history is making your brain work overtime the way it is mine, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the bell, because we do this every week. We take the moments where history almost went differently and we follow them all the way down. You do not want to miss what is coming in the second half of this story, because the Romans are about to re-enter the picture. And when they do, nothing in the Mediterranean world will be ready for them. Subscribe. Like the video. Now let's keep going. Let us talk about Spain. In our timeline, Spain was the proving ground where Rome and Carthage fought their decisive struggle, where Scipio Africanus broke the Barcid Empire and denied Hannibal his reinforcements. The Barcid family had spent 20 years building something extraordinary in the Iberian Peninsula. Not just a military base but a genuine colonial civilization, with new cities, reorganized silver mines, alliances with dozens of indigenous tribal leaders, and a cash economy tied to Carthaginian commercial networks. In this timeline, with Rome eliminated as a rival, the Barcid project in Spain reaches its full potential. Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal, who in our timeline died heroically at the Metaurus River in 207 BC, his severed head thrown before Hannibal's camp as the announcement of Rome's recovery, in this timeline lives and governs. He is a different kind of leader than his brother. Less of a battlefield genius, more of a builder. He understands that the thing Spain needs is not more military campaigns but more cities, more roads, more mines operating at full efficiency, more indigenous leaders brought into the Carthaginian commercial orbit through profit rather than conquest. Under Hasdrubal's governance, and then under the governance of his successors, the Iberian Peninsula becomes the economic engine of the Carthaginian world. The silver mines of the Sierra Morena produce at a scale that makes Carthage the wealthiest state in the known world. The agricultural productivity of the Guadalquivir Valley feeds not just Spain but North Africa. The ports of Gades and New Carthage become the western anchors of a trade network that stretches from the tin mines of Cornwall in Britain to the spice markets of Alexandria in Egypt. The indigenous peoples of Spain, the Iberians, the Celtiberians, the Lusitanians, are not conquered in the Roman sense. They are commercially absorbed. Their tribal leaders are integrated into trading relationships that make cooperation profitable. Over generations, the Punic language spreads not by imposition but by commercial necessity. You needed Punic to do business across the western Mediterranean. So people learned it. North Africa was being transformed in ways that make this timeline almost unrecognizable compared to our own. Without the economic drain of fighting 3 catastrophic wars against Rome, Carthage poured resources into its African hinterland on a scale that was impossible in our timeline. The agricultural revolution begun in the late 4th century BC, when Carthaginian farmers had developed techniques for growing olives, grapes, wheat and barley in the challenging North African climate that were so advanced that the Romans later translated their agricultural manuals into Latin and treated them as sacred texts. That revolution continues and accelerates. The Cap Bon Peninsula, the Majerda Valley, the coastal plains of Tunisia, all of them under intensive cultivation, producing surpluses that Carthage trades across the Mediterranean. The agricultural wealth funds construction. New cities appear along the North African coast. Old cities expand. Leptis Magna, which in our timeline remained a moderately prosperous trading town until the Romans developed it in the 2nd century AD, becomes in this timeline a major metropolis within a century of Rome's exile. Here is the thing about Carthage that Rome never fully understood, and that later historians, working from Roman sources, consistently underestimated. Carthage was extraordinarily good at the thing that actually builds long-term civilizations. Not conquest. Not military domination. Commerce. The patient, accumulative, generation-spanning work of building trading relationships, developing productive land, manufacturing goods that people in other places want to buy, and reinvesting the profits into more productivity. Rome was brilliant at conquest. Carthage was brilliant at commerce. And in a world where there is no one to conquer Carthage, commerce wins. It always wins eventually. It just takes longer. Now stop. Because I need you to think about something for a moment. We have been talking about this alternate world as if it is obviously good, as if the survival of Carthage and the removal of Rome produces a better outcome for everyone involved. But I want to be honest with you, because this channel does not deal in comfortable myths. Carthage was not a paradise. The commercial empire Carthage was building across the western Mediterranean ran on 2 things that we have not talked about yet. The first was the systematic exploitation of subject peoples, Libyan farmers who gave up half their harvest as tribute, Sardinian communities pushed into the mountain interior to make room for Punic settlers, Spanish miners working in conditions of near slavery in the silver mines. The Carthaginian commercial network was profitable precisely because the people at the bottom of it got very little of the profit. The second was actual slavery. On an enormous scale. The Carthaginian economy was slave-dependent in ways that even Rome found excessive. Agricultural estates in North Africa and Sicily ran on enslaved labor. The mines in Spain consumed human lives the way a fire consumes wood. And unlike Rome, which had complicated legal structures around slavery that allowed for manumission and even occasionally for freed slaves to rise to significant social positions, Carthage's slave system was more rigid, more brutal and more permanent. A world dominated by Carthage is not a world of freedom and enlightenment. It is a world of extraordinary commercial sophistication, great architectural ambition, genuine intellectual achievement, and profound, systematic exploitation of everyone at the bottom of the economic ladder. This matters. Remember it as we go forward. Because when the Romans come back into the story, and they are coming back, the question of what kind of world replaces the Carthaginian one is not as simple as it looks. 115 years after the last Roman walked out through the Colline Gate, a young military tribune named Marcus Cornelius Scipio sat on his horse on a bluff above the Danube River and looked down at the city his ancestors had built from nothing. It was not Rome. It could never be Rome. The hills were wrong, gentler, greener, softer than the 7 hills of the original city. The river was wider than the Tiber, darker, colder. The winters were brutal in ways that Mediterranean Romans could never have imagined. months of gray sky and ice that crept across the Danube's surface and trapped river trade for weeks at a time. The olive trees that had been so central to Roman cooking and Roman religious life refused to grow at this latitude. The wine they produced from northern grapes was harsher and thinner than anything you could buy in a Sicilian market. And yet, the streets followed the same grid that Roman urban planners had used for 5 centuries. The Forum sat at the city's heart with the Curia above it and the temples on the surrounding hills. The same sacred fire burned in the Temple of Vesta, the same flame, technically, that had burned in Rome for 500 years before the exile, carried north on its bronze tripod by the Vestals who had guarded it without interruption across every mountain and river and frozen valley of that terrible 3-month march. The Senate met in the same procedural format, with the same forms of address, the same division of the House, the same absolute requirement that no man speak without recognition. The legions were the same. The discipline was the same. The training was the same. Legionaries who had never seen Italy and whose grandfathers had never seen Italy still built their camps every night on the march. The ditch, the earthen wall, the palisade, the Via Praetoria running north to south through the middle, because that was what Roman soldiers did. Not because anyone forced them to. Because they understood that being Roman meant maintaining the discipline even when there was nobody watching. Especially when there was nobody watching. This was the most extraordinary thing about Roman Noricum, and the thing that most historians of this alternate world struggle to adequately explain. The exiled Romans did not dissolve. Every logic of history suggested they should have. They were outnumbered by the indigenous Celtic and Germanic peoples of the region. They had lost their economic base, their agricultural infrastructure, their trade networks, their navy. They had no access to the Mediterranean commerce that had made Roman civilization possible. They were starting essentially from nothing in a hostile environment with a hostile climate. And yet within 1 generation, they had begun absorbing the local Celtic tribes rather than being absorbed by them. Within 2 generations, they were the dominant political force in the Danube basin. Within 3 generations, they had built an empire of their own in the north, not as large as the one they had lost, not as wealthy, but recognizably Roman in its structure. The legions. Always the legions. The Romans brought with them the most sophisticated military system the ancient world had ever produced, and the Celtic and Germanic peoples of the north had nothing to match it. Individual Germanic warriors were formidable, enormous, ferocious, trained from childhood in the use of weapons. But ferocity without formation is just chaos, and chaos loses to discipline every single time. The Roman legion in tight formation, advancing with overlapping shields and coordinated short-sword thrusts, was something that could not be defeated by individual heroism. It required an opposing formation, and the northern tribes had none. So the Romans fought. And they won. And with each victory they extended their territory, absorbed the defeated population as subjects and eventually as citizens, and grew stronger. The old families, the Scipios, the Fabii, the Emilii, the Metelli, maintained their social dominance through their connection to the original Rome, to the sacred bloodlines and priesthoods and political offices that carried meaning precisely because they had been preserved from the original city. But the new families, the families of Celts and Danubians and Germanics who had been absorbed and Romanized and eventually granted citizenship, were increasingly numerous, increasingly wealthy, and increasingly impatient. This internal tension between old families and new families was the defining political reality of Roman Noricum in 100 BC, the world into which Marcus Cornelius Scipio was returning from his northern campaign. The old families wanted to march south. The new families wanted to expand north and east. Both sides were waiting for a sign. They got one. On the Ides of November, 100 BC, 14 eagles flew low over the city of Roman Noricum. This was not a metaphor. This was not a story told later to justify what had already been decided. Every person in the city saw it. Senators and legionaries and slaves and merchants, and the children playing in the streets who stopped and pointed upward at the extraordinary spectacle of 14 enormous birds circling the temple of Jupiter in slow, deliberate formation. 14 was the number of Roman legions. The same number that had stood behind Fabius when he walked up the wooden steps to meet Hannibal above the plain of Rome. The eagles circled the temple for an entire morning. Then they turned and flew south until they were out of sight. The Roman priests said nothing for a full day. Then the College of Augurs issued a statement that was copied and posted in public places across the city within hours. The statement said 3 words. The time comes. Marcus Scipio heard about the eagles when he was 9 days' ride north of the city. The messenger who brought him the news of his special Senate assignment did not mention the eagles explicitly, but Marcus knew. He had heard. Every soldier at the northern frontier had heard within days. He rode south with his heart hammering. For 5 generations the Scipios had maintained the vow that had been sworn in the temple of Capitoline Jupiter on the last night Rome was Roman. Return. Liberate. Rebuild. The vow had been their identity, their inheritance, the thing that distinguished them from the new families who had no stake in the old city and no memory of the 7 hills except as a story told by grandparents. Now the gods had spoken. And Marcus Scipio, 25 years old, decorated veteran of 3 northern campaigns, descendant of the man who had said, "We will found a new Rome in the north," in the Senate chamber on the day Rome died, was about to be handed the most dangerous assignment in the history of what remained of the Roman world. He was going south. Not to fight. Not yet. First, he had to find out what was down there. The Senate's assignment was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Marcus Scipio was to travel south through the Alpine passes, across the Po Valley, down through the Italian peninsula, and eventually into the Mediterranean world that Rome had been exiled from 115 years ago. He was to observe. He was to listen. He was to assess the military strength of the Carthaginian positions in Italy, the mood of the Italic peoples living under Carthaginian governance, the state of the roads and the harbours and the defensive structures. He was, in other words, a spy. He would travel as a merchant, a role that required him to learn enough of the trader's Greek that was the common language of Mediterranean commerce to be convincing. He would carry trade goods. He would stay in inns and market towns and coastal ports. He would not announce who he was. He would not carry Roman military insignia. He would be, to every eye that saw him, exactly what he appeared to be, a prosperous northern merchant with an interest in finding southern trading partners. The Senate gave him one companion, a man named Gaius Laelius, chosen specifically because his mother had been a Gallic woman and his features were therefore less identifiably Roman than most of the old family men, broader, fairer, less Mediterranean in the way that Romans had always been Mediterranean. Laelius was also, and this mattered enormously, fluent in both Punic and Greek. He had grown up in a trading family on the Danube and had spent his youth moving goods between the Roman north and the Celtic world to the west. "You understand," said the senior consul, a man named Quintus Fulvius, on the morning Marcus received his briefing, "that if you are identified as Romans, we cannot acknowledge you. There is no rescue mission available. You are, officially, a private merchant named Marcus Gallio of the Danube Trading House. Whatever happens to you happens to Marcus Gallio." "Understood," said Marcus. "You also understand that what you bring back will determine whether 5 generations of vows come to anything at all. Come back with the wrong assessment, too optimistic, too pessimistic, and we march south into a disaster that finishes what Hannibal started. Come back with nothing, and we wait another generation for the gods to send 14 eagles again." "Understood," said Marcus again. Fulvius studied him. "Do you have any questions?" Marcus thought for a moment. Then he asked the only question that actually mattered. "Is it still Rome down there? The city? Is it still—" He stopped. He was not sure how to finish the sentence. Fulvius understood anyway. "The Greek traders say the name has not changed. Whether anything else has, that is what you are going to find out." The Alpine crossing in late autumn was brutal. Not as brutal as what the original exiles had endured. Marcus had warm northern-made wool, proper mountain boots, a guide who knew the passes intimately, and the knowledge that on the other side lay civilization rather than unknown darkness. But brutal enough. The passes were narrow and icy, and the wind at the high points cut through every layer of clothing with a contemptuous efficiency that made Marcus understand, for the first time viscerally rather than intellectually, what those 500,000 people 115 years ago had endured. He thought about that a great deal on the descent into Italy. What was it like to make this crossing knowing you were going away? Knowing you were leaving, not arriving? Knowing that the warmth you were marching toward was the warmth of a homeland you would never see again? The old centurion whose shoulders had shaken once. The Vestal virgins carrying the sacred flame in temperatures that must have threatened to extinguish it. The mothers with infants whose crying the cold had silenced in ways the parents had not allowed themselves to understand until the next morning. He had heard these stories his entire life. In Roma Noricum, The stories of the exile were what other peoples used scripture for. They were the foundational narratives, read aloud at festivals, taught to children before they learned to read, carved into the public monuments of the city as both history and promise. Coming to them this way, from the inside, approaching Italy from the north as the exiles had left it, made them feel different. Not smaller, larger, more impossible, more extraordinary, more worth the return. The Pa Valley in 100 BC was unrecognizable. Marcus had studied maps. He had read the accounts of traders who came down from the north every few years with goods and returned with information as valuable as the goods. He thought he knew what to expect. He did not know what to expect. The Gallic tribes of the Pa Valley, who in the time of the exile had been Hannibal's restless and sometimes unreliable allies, had been thoroughly absorbed into the Carthaginian commercial world over the course of a century. Their hilltop oppida, the fortified settlements that had been the centers of Celtic political life, had been replaced in many cases by proper towns on the Punic model, with rectangular street grids and market squares and temples to a bewildering combination of Punic, Celtic, and lingering Italic deities. The people Marcus passed in the market towns spoke a mixture of languages that he found difficult to follow even with his Greek. Punic words were woven into what was clearly a descendant of the Gallic Celtic language, with occasional Italic terms surviving from the communities that had been in this valley before either Gaul or Carthage arrived. Nobody spoke Latin. This hit Marcus harder than he had expected. He had known, intellectually, that Latin would not have survived in the south without Rome to maintain it. But knowing it intellectually and hearing it confirmed by the complete silence of a language that was the very sound of his civilization, that was different. He asked Laelius, quietly, that night in an inn somewhere east of what had been the Roman colony of Placentia, now a prosperous trading town with a Punic-style harbor on the Po River. "Does anyone down here remember the Romans?" Laelius poured his wine and thought about it. "The old ones have stories. Grandparents' stories, mostly. A people who were here and then left. Most of them think the Romans are gone entirely. Dissolved into the north somewhere." Marcus drank his wine without speaking. "Are you all right?" Laelius asked. "I am trying to decide," Marcus said carefully, "whether that makes what we are planning easier or harder." Laelius looked at him. "Which answer do you want it to be?" Marcus set down his cup. "The one that gets us home safely. We can decide the rest when we get back." Think about what Marcus is dealing with right now. He is the descendant of people who have maintained a vow for 5 generations, who have built an entire national identity around the promise of return. And he is sitting in a town that used to be Roman, listening to the sound of a world that has completely forgotten his people ever existed. Does he go back and tell the Senate that Rome is truly gone, that the world has moved on and the vow should be released? Or does he tell them what the 14 eagles said? This is the question at the heart of this entire story. And it is about to get a great deal more complicated. Rome was more beautiful than Marcus had imagined. He had grown up with descriptions of it: the Forum at noon when the marble gleamed white in the Mediterranean sun, the temples on the surrounding hills, the Tiber moving slow and brown between its banks, the sound of a city of 500,000 people going about its daily life. The descriptions had been lovingly maintained in Roma Noricum, passed from generation to generation like family silver, polished regularly so they would not tarnish. The descriptions were accurate. They were also completely inadequate. Standing at the edge of the Forum on a November morning, disguised as a Danube merchant in his northern wool and his broader-cut traveling clothes, Marcus Scipio looked at what Carthage had done with Rome in 115 years and felt something he had not anticipated. He felt impressed. The original Roman buildings were still standing. The temple of Capitoline Jupiter on the hill above the Forum was exactly as described. The great terracotta statue of the god, painted red with his black beard and golden eyes, still gazed out from the doors that were left open in his honor. The temple of Vesta still stood in the Forum, though no sacred flame burned within it. The Curia building was intact, though its interior had been converted into a Carthaginian administrative office. But around and between and above the Roman structures, Carthaginian architects had been building for a century. And Carthaginian architecture, the eclectic, confident, aesthetically adventurous tradition that mixed Egyptian and Greek and Levantine elements into something that had no exact parallel anywhere else in the ancient world, had transformed Rome into something simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. New buildings rose alongside the old ones in the Punic style: thick stone walls, flat roofs with decorative parapets, Egyptian-influenced cornicing with a distinctive Punic winged disc motif, columns with Ionic capitals that had been subtly modified from their Greek originals in ways that were hard to identify but impossible not to notice. The effect was of a city that had been loved by people who were not its original inhabitants and who had therefore loved it differently, generously, enthusiastically, without the sense of obligation that makes love careful. The streets were clean. The aqueducts functioned. The markets were extraordinary. Marcus had never seen such density and variety of goods in any market of Roman Noricum. North African olive oil and grain. Sicilian wine of a quality that made the northern stuff taste like vinegar. Spanish silver worked into jewelry of intricate Punic design. Silk from eastern trade routes that Carthaginian merchants had opened with the Greek successor kingdoms. Glass from workshops in Sidon that was clearer and thinner than anything produced anywhere else in the known world. The population was as mixed as any Marcus had ever encountered. Punic merchants in their characteristic linen robes. Numidian cavalry families in the rich mixed dress of people who had absorbed both North African and Mediterranean fashion. Sicilian Greeks who had migrated north to take advantage of the commercial opportunities the Carthaginian administration offered. Italic peoples, the descendants of the Samnites and Oscans and Umbrians who had been Rome's subjects and were now Carthage's, going about their daily lives in a language Marcus could almost but not quite follow, something that had drifted from the Latin base he knew toward something new and still becoming. He spent 3 days in the city. He visited the temple of Capitoline Jupiter on the second day, climbing the hill alone while Laelius attended to their ostensible trading business in the market. The great doors were open as always. Inside, the terracotta Jupiter gazed down with his painted golden eyes at an interior that was now half Roman and half something else. A Punic incense burner stood before the Roman altar, which Marcus found both offensive and strangely moving. Even the god had been absorbed. He stood before the statue for a long time. He was not sure what he was asking. He was not even sure he was asking anything. But he stood there in the cool November light coming through the open doors, looking up at the painted face of the god his ancestors had worshipped for centuries, and he made a decision. He was going further south. The Senate had told him to assess the Italian peninsula. He had done that. What the Senate had not told him, because the Senate had not known to ask, was what Carthage itself looked like after 115 years of unchallenged dominance. He needed to see Carthage. The journey by ship from Ostia to Carthage took 4 days in good weather. Marcus had never been on the open sea. Roman Noricum was a river empire, the Danube was its highway, and Marcus was comfortable on river craft. But the Mediterranean in November was something else entirely, and the Carthaginian merchant vessel that carried him and Laelius south was a broad-beamed, deep-hulled ship of a type he had never seen, built for cargo capacity rather than speed, crewed by a mixed team of North African and Sicilian sailors who handled the vessel with the casual expertise of people who had grown up on water. He was seasick for the first day. He recovered his dignity on the second. By the third he was standing at the prow watching the color of the water change from the gray-green of the northern Mediterranean to the extraordinary deep blue of the open sea. On the fourth morning he saw Carthage. It was larger than he had imagined. It was larger, he suspected, than anything he could have imagined, because nothing in his experience had given him the scale to measure against. The city spread across the entire peninsula, climbing from the harbor complex on the water to the great hill, the Bursa, at its center, crowned with temples and public buildings whose scale was visible from miles out at sea. "There it is," said Laelius quietly beside him. Marcus said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about Hannibal standing on a hill above Rome watching his ancestors walk away. He was thinking about Fabius, erect as a cavalry trooper at 70, riding to meet the man who had ended his world and negotiating the terms with the composure of a man buying grain in the Forum. Then he said, "It is very large." "Yes," said Laelius. "We will need a great many legions." Laelius looked at him sharply. The Senate said assess, not invade. "I am assessing," Marcus said. He watched the city grow as the ship moved toward the harbor entrance. "I am assessing that we will need a great many legions. Stay with me, because what Marcus finds inside Carthage, and what it means for the question of whether Roman Noricum should march south at all, is the most important part of this entire story. If you are not subscribed to this channel yet, do it now. Hit like, because the final act of this alternate history is the part that rewrites everything you thought you understood about what happens when a civilization comes back from the dead. Carthage in 100 BC was the most powerful city on earth. Not the largest. Alexandria in Egypt had grown into something of almost incomprehensible scale under the Ptolemies, its library alone employing hundreds of scholars, its population swelling with merchants and philosophers and refugees from every corner of the known world. But Alexandria was a Greek city wearing an Egyptian costume, built by foreigners on the Nile Delta, sustained by the agricultural miracle of the Nile flood rather than by any internal commercial dynamism. Carthage was different. Carthage had built its power from the inside out, from the harbor complex that Marcus could see from the approaching ship, with its circular war harbor and its commercial port working in perfect, engineered synchrony, to the agricultural estates of the Cap Bon Peninsula that fed the city and produced surpluses for export, to the silver flowing in from Spain and the purple dye flowing in from its North African coastal factories and the grain mountains of Sardinia arriving in the torpedo-shaped amphorae that Carthaginian merchants had been using for 3 centuries. The city worked. That was the thing that struck Marcus most forcefully in the 3 days he spent walking its streets in his merchant's disguise. Not its beauty, though it was genuinely beautiful, the Bursa hill crowned with its Punic Hellenistic temples reflecting the afternoon sun in colors that no cold northern city could have matched. Not its scale, though the scale was humbling. What struck him was that the city worked. The harbor functioned. The markets functioned. The water distribution system functioned. The administrative apparatus functioned. Somewhere, behind all of this, a governing class was making decisions at a level of competence that produced visible, daily results in the lives of everyone in the city. He was impressed. He was also, for the first time since leaving Roma Noricum, genuinely afraid. What Marcus found inside Carthage was not what he had been taught to expect. In Roma Noricum, the image of Carthage that had been passed down through 5 generations was the image of Carthage as Rome had known it, a commercial oligarchy, internally divided between the Barcid military faction and the conservative council families, perpetually threatened by its own subject populations, dependent on mercenary soldiers whose loyalty lasted exactly as long as the silver kept flowing. That Carthage had been real in 215 BC. It was not the Carthage of 100 BC. 115 years of unchallenged dominance had produced something genuinely new. The tensions between the military and civilian factions had resolved themselves, not through one side winning, but through the gradual emergence of a governing class that combined both functions. The Sephites, the 2 chief magistrates who served as Carthage's version of consuls, were now typically men who had both commercial experience and military service. The Council of Elders had been broadened over the generations to include families from the Punic colonies in Spain, Sicily, and Sardinia. The Popular Assembly had acquired more genuine influence. It was not a democracy. It was nothing like what Athens had attempted. But it was a more genuinely representative oligarchy than Carthage had ever been, and it had produced a century of political stability that showed in every street and building and functioning institution Marcus observed. The slave system remained. Marcus watched the slave markets in the harbor district with the expressionless face of a trader assessing goods, and felt the nausea he had been warned to hide. Tens of thousands of enslaved people moved through Carthage annually, Libyan, Numidian, Iberian, Celtic, occasionally Greek. The mines in Spain alone consumed human lives at a rate that Marcus calculated, grimly, over 3 days of careful observation and the price information Laelius extracted from traders, at somewhere between 10 and 15,000 deaths per year. This was the foundation beneath the beautiful city. This was what paid for the temples and the harbor engineering and the agricultural surplus and the silver artistry in the market stalls. He thought about this on his last night in Carthage, sitting with Laelius in a quiet inn near the harbor district, listening to the sounds of the city settling into its evening rhythms. Music from a nearby establishment. The creak of ships in the harbor. The distant voices of the overnight dockworkers beginning their shift. "When we go back," he said quietly, "and I give my report to the Senate, there will be 2 factions." "There are always 2 factions," Laelius observed. "One will say, Carthage is too strong. We cannot challenge it. We should stay in the north and build what we have. The vow has been kept long enough." He paused. "The other will say, we must march south, because the gods have spoken and the Scipios have sworn and 5 generations of Romans have kept faith with something that demands completion." "Which faction are you in?" Laelius asked. Marcus was quiet for a long time. "I am in the faction," he said finally, "that believes the question is not whether we can defeat Carthage. I think we can. The legions are as good as they have ever been, possibly better, because they have spent a century fighting Germanic and Celtic tribesmen who are more individually dangerous than Mediterranean opponents, and they have not lost a campaign in living memory. Then what is the question? The question, Marcus said, is what kind of world we build if we win. He looked at the lamp on the table between them. Rome in our history, the Rome of the 7 Hills, before the exile, built an empire by making its subjects into Romans. Not perfectly, not fairly, not without violence. But eventually, genuinely. The people of Spain and Gaul and North Africa and Greece became Roman citizens. They sat in the Senate. They wrote literature in Latin. They built the same temples and followed the same laws. The empire was large enough and lasting enough and inclusive enough that when it eventually fell, everything it had built, the language, the law, the roads, the architectural tradition, survived and became the foundation of the world that came after. He paused. Carthage has not done that. Carthage has built a commercial empire, and it is magnificent, and it functions, and it has produced genuine achievements in agriculture and engineering and trade. But its subjects are not Carthaginians. They are subject peoples. And what is built on subject peoples rather than citizens eventually collapses back into the component parts. Laelius watched him. So you are going back to recommend the march? I am going back, Marcus said, to recommend that we think very carefully about what we are marching toward. Not just the defeat of Carthage. Not just the recovery of the 7 Hills. But the question of what we do with everyone between the Danube and the African coast when it is over. He left Carthage on a grey morning, the November wind carrying the smell of rain and salt water. The ship that would take him back to Ostia was loading in the outer harbor. As he walked down the dock, he turned and looked back at the city one more time. The Bursa hill rose above everything, its temples catching the last of the morning light. 115 years of Carthaginian civilization, visible in every stone and street and harbor wall. 115 years during which the world had turned without Rome and had, in many ways, functioned well enough. The Romans in their frozen northern city had maintained their identity through discipline and vow and the fierce refusal to be absorbed. The Mediterranean world without them had not collapsed. It had changed, developed, produced its own achievements and its own injustices, and moved forward into something that was genuinely different from the world that would have been. Now the eagles had flown south. And Marcus Scipio, 25 years old and carrying more information than any Roman in 5 generations, was about to get on a ship and go home and tell his people what he had seen. Here is where we must leave the story, suspended at its most important moment, the way history itself is always suspended at the moments that matter most. Because the decision Marcus brings back to the Senate is not just his decision. It is the decision of everything that Rome had preserved across a century of exile, and everything that Carthage had built in the space that Rome left behind. What actually happens next, whether Roman Noricum marches south, whether the vow is fulfilled, whether something genuinely Roman is rebuilt on the shores of the Mediterranean, that is the story that John Maddox Roberts tells in his novel. And if this video has made you want to read it, I genuinely encourage you to do so. But here is the deeper question that this alternate history forces us to confront, the question that makes it more than just a clever thought experiment. Everything that defines the modern Western world was built on what Rome became after this period. The legal tradition, the linguistic inheritance, the architectural language, the political concepts of citizenship and representation and the rule of law. Christianity itself, which emerged in Roman Judea, spread through Roman roads and Roman trade networks, was shaped by Roman theological debates, and became a world religion because the Roman Empire both persecuted it and eventually adopted it. None of that happens in this timeline. Something else happens instead, something with Punic commercial sophistication and Greek scientific tradition and the slowly developing political innovations of a Carthage that never had to destroy itself fighting Rome. Whether that something is better or worse than what we got is genuinely unanswerable. What is certain is that it would be different. Profoundly, irreversibly, fascinatingly different. And that is the point of alternate history. Not to tell you that history went wrong, or that history could have been better, or that the people who made the decisions that shaped our world were making the wrong choices. The point of alternate history is to hold up a mirror, to show you the world as it is by showing you the world as it was not, and let you see the outlines of what was chosen by looking at the shape of what was left behind. Rome chose to walk away in 215 BC, in this story. In ours, it did not. In ours, it found Fabius, and Fabius found Patience, and Patience found Scipio, and Scipio found Zama, and Zama found the Punic world's end. The two worlds diverge at a single morning on a wooden platform above an Italian plain, where a general offered mercy and a city had to decide what its survival was worth. The question that alternate history asks, and that this story has been building toward for the last 50 minutes, is not which choice was right. The question is, what does your choice reveal about what you value? The Romans who walked north chose their identity over their geography. They said, "We are not the 7 hills. We are the laws and the fire and the discipline and the vow. We can rebuild the place. We cannot rebuild the people if we lose them to a sword on an Italian plain." Whether they were right is something you get to decide. If this story made you think, if it changed anything about how you understand Rome, or Carthage, or the way history actually works, share it with someone tonight. Subscribe to my YouTube channel to get more of this. Leave a comment below telling me which part of this alternate world you found most compelling. Was it the exiled Romans building their frozen empire on the Danube? Was it Archimedes living to complete his work? Was it Marcus Scipio standing in the forum of a Rome that had forgotten Latin and feeling the particular grief of a man whose home has continued without him? Tell me. I read every comment on this channel. Subscribe if you have not already. Hit the like button. It genuinely matters for getting these stories in front of the people who need to hear them. And remember, history did not have to happen the way it did. Every moment that shaped the world you live in was, at some point, a decision made by a human being who could have decided differently. The world that would have been is always watching from just behind the world that is.